The morning started the same way it always did on the Harlan place, before the sun even cracked the eastern ridge, before the coffee finished brewing on the wood stove, before the rooster had made up his mind whether it was worth the effort. Earl Harlan was already in his boots, already halfway across the yard, already listening, because on a cattle farm in rural Missouri in the late 1940s, listening was a skill you either developed fast or paid for dearly. The land demanded it, the animals demanded it, and the seasons, which had no patience for a farmer who was not paying attention, demanded it most of all. He heard it before he saw it, a low, heaving sound, not quite a moan, not quite a cough, coming from the far end of the south pasture. Something was wrong with one of his Herefords. He knew it the way a man knows a bad storm is coming before a single cloud appears in the sky. You just know. It is in the air, in the sound, in some combination of signals that your brain has learned to read before you are even conscious of reading them. And when Earl Harlan got to that animal, a 3-year-old cow he had been nursing through her second calving season, he found her standing stiff-legged, neck stretched out long and low, mouth open, sides heaving like a bellows working a forge fire. She was not breathing right. She was choking. Right then, on that cold October morning, with frost still on the grass and the nearest veterinarian 40 miles down a road that turned to mud every time it rained, Earl Harlan had to make a decision. Not the kind of decision you make sitting in a comfortable chair with all the time in the world and a phone in your pocket. The kind you make in seconds, with $250 worth of cow dying in front of you and a family counting on every single animal to make it through winter. His wife was at the house. His boys were at school. It was just him and this cow, and whatever he knew or did not know about what to do next. What he did next is the reason we are here today. To understand why cattle choke and why it became one of the most feared and most preventable crises on American farms between the 1930s and 1970s, you have to understand something about how cattle eat. Unlike horses, unlike humans, cattle are built to graze. Their entire anatomy is optimized for pulling grass slowly across a broad, flat tongue, chewing it partially, swallowing it into a multi-chambered stomach, and then bringing it back up later to chew it again. That process is called rumination, and it is one of the most elegant digestive systems nature ever engineered. Farmers who had spent their lives around cattle understood it intimately without ever knowing its scientific name. They just knew that cows chewed their cud in the afternoon, lying in the shade, peaceful and methodical, finishing the job they had started in the morning. That was a healthy cow. That was things working the way they were supposed to work. But the system had one critical vulnerability, and it was a vulnerability that showed up most dangerously at the feed trough. Cattle do not chew their food completely before swallowing, not the first time around. They are designed to eat fast, to pull in as much as possible while out in the open, where predators could come from any direction, and process it later in a safe place. That ancient instinct does not disappear just because a cow is standing in a fenced pasture in Iowa in 1952. The animal still eats like it is on a savanna somewhere. Fast, greedy, with very little attention paid to the size of what is going down the throat. When you add competition, a dozen cows at a bunk with room for 8, each one pushing and shoving to get her share, that already fast eating becomes frantic, and frantic eating is when bad things happen. When you put a large piece of vegetable matter, a whole ear of corn, a big apple, a chunk of turnip or sweet potato, a dense clump of wet hay compressed into a ball by the weight of the pile above it, directly into the feeding path of a hungry cow, there is a real and genuine chance that animal is going to swallow something too big for its esophagus to handle. The result is what farmers call a choke. The object gets lodged somewhere between the back of the throat and the entrance to the first stomach, the rumen. The cow cannot push it down, it cannot bring it back up, and it cannot breathe properly. It stands there with that terrible stretched neck posture, that look of dumb panic in its eyes, and every minute that passes without help is a minute closer to a crisis that cannot be undone. Now here is where it gets genuinely dangerous, and fast. When a cow is choking, the rumen does not stop working. The normal fermentation process that happens constantly in that first stomach keeps producing gas. Under normal circumstances, that gas is expelled through belching. It is a constant, quiet, automatic process that healthy cattle do dozens of times a day without anyone noticing. But when an animal is choking, the reflex that allows it to belch is disrupted. The gas has nowhere to go, and the rumen begins to bloat. Farmers called it bloat, and they knew it as one of the fastest killers on a farm. A cow that started choking on a moderate obstruction could be dead from bloat in as little as 2 to 4 hours if nothing was done. 2 to 4 hours. On a farm where the vet was 40 miles away, and you might not reach him by telephone until well after noon, because the party line telephone shared among 6 or 8 farm families on a shared rural line was always busy in the morning. Everybody trying to call everybody else about the same storm, the same market prices, the same problems. 2 to 4 hours was not the comfortable window it might sound like. It was a race, and the clock started the moment the cow took that first wrong swallow. This was the reality facing American cattle farmers for decades, and the solutions they developed, working with what they had, in barns and pastures and feedlots across the Midwest and the South and the Great Plains, became some of the most practical, proven, and quietly brilliant pieces of agricultural wisdom ever passed down from one generation to the next. Not written in textbooks at first, not endorsed by universities at first, just known, carried in the hands and the memory of the people who had learned it through the hardest possible teacher, which is loss. Let us go back to Earl Harlan for a moment, because his story is the story of thousands of farmers like him across the American heartland, and what he knew that October morning came directly from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, going back to a time when there were no veterinarians within reasonable reach of most American farms at all. This was inherited knowledge, living knowledge, the kind that does not get written down in textbooks, but gets passed across kitchen tables and fence lines, and at the grain elevator on Saturday mornings, when the men gathered to talk while the auger ran and the wagons slowly emptied. That grain elevator, standing at the edge of every small rural town from Ohio to Nebraska, was not just a place where you sold your corn. It was a clearinghouse of practical knowledge, a place where the collective intelligence of an entire farming community pooled and circulated and found its way back out to the farms that needed it. Earl did not panic. Panic was a luxury that farm animals did not allow you. Instead, he did what his father had always told him. He looked at the animal's left side. On a healthy cow, the left flank, the upper area between the last rib and the hip, is relatively flat or only slightly rounded. On a cow that has been choking for more than a few minutes, that same area begins to swell visibly, like a tire being slowly inflated from the inside. Earl looked. The swelling was there, but not severe. He had time. Not a lot, but some. The first thing he did was locate the obstruction. He ran his hand along the left side of the cow's neck, pressing gently, feeling for a hard lump in the esophagus. The esophagus in cattle runs along the left side of the neck, not the center, the left side. And when an object is lodged there, you can sometimes feel it clearly, like a billiard ball sitting inside a length of garden hose. Earl felt it about 2/3 of the way down the neck. Dense, hard, an ear of corn that had come out of the feed bunk with the shucks still partially on, and the cow had swallowed it the way hungry cows always did, without a second thought and without nearly enough chewing. He began to massage, gently but firmly, working the object back toward the mouth from below, never pushing down, always up. The way you might work a stubborn knot out of a rope with patient rhythmic pressure. He was trying to encourage the esophageal muscles to reverse their contractions, to move the object back up rather than down. The cow leaned hard against the fence, threw her head twice, stomped in the frost. Earl kept working. His shoulders burned. His hands were stiff with cold. He kept working. After roughly 20 minutes of steady effort, the ear of corn came back up in pieces, and the cow coughed it out into the frost, shook her head hard enough to throw slobber across Earl's jacket, and immediately turned back toward the feed bunk as though the last 20 minutes had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. He blocked her from getting there for another 10 minutes, let her settle. Watched her left flank closely to make sure the swelling from the partial bloat was going down and not increasing. It went down. She was going to be all right. That afternoon, Earl went to his barn and looked at his feed bunk. Really looked at it, the way you look at something after it has almost cost you something you could not afford to lose. He measured the height with his arm. It was too low. Just above knee level, exactly the wrong angle for a hungry animal eating fast. He looked at the spacing. He was running 40 cows through a bunk built for 30. He looked at the corn pile, whole ears, some still fully husked, exactly what he had been feeding all fall without a second thought. He stood there for a long time in the cold afternoon light, going through it all in his head, connecting what had almost happened to the things in front of him that had allowed it to happen. Then he went to work. He spent that weekend making changes. He rebuilt the end sections of the bunk to raise it 6 inches. He ran a batch of corn through the hand-cranked roller mill his father had left him, that heavy, iron-geared machine that sat in the corner of the barn and that he had not used in 2 seasons, and ground 2 weeks' worth of feed in advance. He started wetting down the corn before each feeding with a bucket and a half of water, mixed in with a long-handled wooden paddle. He kept hooked on the barn wall beside the door. He never had another choke case that winter, and he told his brother-in-law about what he had done at Thanksgiving, over pie and coffee at the long table, after the women had cleared the dishes, the way farm knowledge always traveled in those communities, through family, through friendship, through the slow and steady accumulation of shared experience that built up over years into something stronger and more reliable than any single person's memory could hold alone. His brother-in-law changed his bunk height the following Monday. To understand the full system that farmers developed around this problem, what we are calling the old trough trick, though it was never called that at the time, and had no single name because it was not a single thing but a collection of related practices, you have to understand all of its pieces and why each one mattered. The trough itself was the foundation, not what went in it, but how it was built and where it sat in relation to the animals eating from it. Farmers who had watched cattle choke over the years noticed something that took a while to articulate, but was clear once you saw it. Choking happened most often when animals ate from a level surface, a flat feed bunk, or the ground, or a pile, because in those positions a cow's head is angled downward and slightly extended, which is the worst possible angle for swallowing a large piece of food safely. The throat opens in a way that gives a dense, rounded object a nearly unobstructed path into the esophagus. Raise the feed off the ground, not dramatically, not to some awkward height that forces the animal to strain upward, just enough to change the angle of the head and neck slightly, and the geometry of swallowing changes in ways that matter. The cow has to lift its head just a fraction to reach the feed. The throat flexes differently. The esophagus opens at an angle that gives swallowed material a cleaner, more angled path rather than a straight drop. And the animal, eating from a slightly elevated surface, tends to slow down just a fraction, not enough that you would notice it standing there watching, but enough at the level of the individual swallow to reduce the likelihood of a large mass going down intact. A small change in behavior, compounded over hundreds of swallows across a feeding season, added up to real protection. The feed preparation was the second piece. Corn was the great choking culprit, and also the great feed staple of American cattle farming. There was no getting around corn, because corn was energy, corn was weight gain, corn was the difference between a calf that made weight by spring and one that did not. But whole ears of corn fed carelessly to hungry cattle competing at a crowded bunk were a recipe for exactly the kind of disaster Earl Harlan had narrowly avoided. Farmers learned this the hard way, and the response that became most widespread was the cracking of corn before feeding. Running the ears through a roller mill broke the kernels into pieces that could be chewed and swallowed safely. Cracked corn could not lodge in an esophagus. The same principle applied to root vegetables, turnips, mangel-wurzels, sugar beets, potatoes, which were common and economical livestock feed supplements in many parts of the country. A whole turnip could kill a cow. Turnip chunks no bigger than a large walnut were safe. The difference between those two things was 5 minutes of work with a hatchet or a cutting board, and 5 minutes of work was an investment that paid off the first time it prevented a choke. Moisture was the third piece, and in some ways the most elegant, because it cost almost nothing and required almost no additional labor. Farmers discovered, and this was confirmed later by agricultural extension publications from land-grant universities across the Midwest, that dampening dry feed before putting it in the trough reduced the choking hazard significantly. Dry corn, dry grain of any kind, when swallowed by a greedy cow in a large mass, could form a dense, compact plug in the esophagus. The same material, moistened with water until it was soft and slightly cohesive, formed a mass that the esophageal muscles could move. It would not lodge. It would slide down the way feed was supposed to slide down. In parts of the South and Appalachia, farmers called this practice slicking the feed because the moisture made everything slick and easy for an animal to manage. Whatever you called it, the principle was identical. Add water, reduce risk. So a bucket of water per 100 pounds of feed was the rough ratio that experienced cattle farmers across the Corn Belt settled on through their own trial and error, though the exact amount varied by feed type and by individual preference. The goal was soft feed, not soupy feed, just soft enough that the hard edges were gone and the pieces would yield under pressure rather than compact into something immovable. The fourth piece was spacing, and this was the one that took the most structural investment and therefore the one that got delayed the longest on the farms that needed it most. Cattle are competitive eaters by nature. Their instinct at the feed bunk is the same instinct that drives them to eat fast out in the pasture. Get as much as possible before something bigger or faster takes it from you. Put 20 cows at a bunk designed for 15, and you will get exactly that dynamic playing out every single feeding, twice a day, all winter long. Animals shoving, pushing, eating at a pace driven by competition rather than hunger. And competitive eating is fast eating, and fast eating is the conditions under which choke happens. The recommended 24 to 30 inches of bunk space per cow that agricultural extension agents were promoting by the late 1940s was not an arbitrary number. It was derived from watching actual cattle at actual bunks and measuring the point at which the competitive dynamic diminished enough to allow animals to eat at a more natural pace. Farmers who could not immediately afford to extend their bunk sometimes managed the problem by splitting their herd into 2 feeding groups and running them through the bunk in shifts. More work, without question. But it worked, and it cost nothing except time. The 1950s brought changes to American agriculture that accelerated the spread of these practices beyond what the informal community networks of the previous generation could have managed on their own. The Agricultural Extension Service, which had existed in various forms since the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, reached new levels of organization and effectiveness in the post-war years. County agents drove out to farms across the country with printed materials, demonstration tools, and the results of university research that had been studying cattle nutrition and management with new scientific rigor since the end of the war. The land-grant university system, those state agricultural colleges established under the Morrill Act in the 1860s, which had spent nearly a century building the scientific foundation of American farming, was producing practical bulletins on cattle feeding management that included explicit recommendations about trough height, feed preparation, moisture content, and animal spacing. Texas A&M Ohio State, University of Missouri Iowa State. These institutions were translating what farmers already knew through experience into the language of science and sending it back out to the farms in printed form in those small folded bulletins that showed up in the rural mailbox alongside the Sears and Roebuck catalog and the weekly county paper. But the relationship was never one-directional, and the best extension agents knew it. The most knowledgeable people in any rural county were always the farmers who had been working the same land for 3 or 4 generations. When an extension agent sat down with Earl Harlan or a man like him, it was a conversation, not a lecture. The agent brought laboratory data and university findings. The farmer brought 40 years of watching what actually happened when you changed the feed or rebuilt the bunk, or switched from whole corn to cracked corn in the middle of a feeding season. Both kinds of knowledge mattered. The combination of the two, multiplied across thousands of farm visits in thousands of counties across the country, was how American agriculture improved as fast as it did in those post-war decades. The old trough trick, in all its regional variations, was part of that improvement. A humble, unglamorous, practical piece of wisdom that saved cattle and saved farms and made the difference for families like the Harlans. Between a winter survived and a winter that broke them, not every farm had an Earl Harlan who caught the problem in time, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the losses were real and they hit hardest in the years when everything else was already going wrong. During the droughts and agricultural depressions of the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl was grinding the southern Great Plains into a wasteland, and farm families across the country were already walking the edge of survival, losing a cow to something as preventable as choke was a catastrophe that could not be overstated. A dairy cow in the 1930s represented hundreds of dollars in value and an irreplaceable source of daily income for a family that might have no other. A beef cow that was supposed to become cash at the fall sale could mean the difference between making the mortgage payment and losing the farm. Banks did not care about your choke losses. The mortgage company did not care. The feed bill collector did not care. The only people who cared were your neighbors, who were fighting the same battles, and your family, who worked alongside you every day and understood down to the bone what every animal on that farm meant to the life you were all trying to hold together. This is why the community knowledge networks of rural America during those years were not merely convenient. They were survival systems. The party line telephone was not just a communication tool. It was a lifeline, a shared nervous system connecting farms that might be miles apart into something that functioned in its rough and informal way, like a community of practice. You picked up the receiver, and you might hear your neighbor 2 farms over explaining to her sister what her husband had done to save a bloated cow that morning. And without ever meaning to, you had just learned something that might save your own animal 6 months from now. The grain elevator on a Saturday morning in November, with a dozen farmers waiting for their wagons to unload, and the auger running its constant steady noise in the background, was a classroom where no tuition was charged, and the curriculum was whatever somebody had just figured out that week. There is something else worth understanding about why this particular problem occupied such a significant place in the mental landscape of the mid-century American cattle farmer. Farm families of that era had a relationship with their animals that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who did not grow up in that world. It was not purely sentimental. These were working animals, and farmers were not confused about the economics of it. A cow that could not earn her keep was a cow that eventually had to go. That was the math, and everybody understood the math. But it was also not purely transactional. You spent every morning and every evening with these animals, in all seasons, in all weathers. You knew their individual personalities, which ones were gentle and which ones were difficult, which ones always pushed to the front of the bunk, and which ones hung back and waited for the crowd to thin. You had pulled calves from them at 2 in the morning in a February ice storm, kneeling in the straw with a lantern hanging from a nail, doing the work that needed doing because there was nobody else to do it. You had treated them for pink eye and foot rot, and a dozen other ailments. You had watched them graze on summer evenings in a pasture your grandfather had cleared and your father had fenced. And there was something in that image, cattle moving slowly through tall grass in the long light of a July evening, that connected to everything you believed about what it meant to work the land well. Watching one of them die of something preventable, when you did not know how to prevent it, was a particular kind of misery that stayed with a farmer. And learning how to prevent it, finding the trick, passing it to your neighbor, knowing that you now had the knowledge to protect what was in your care, was a particular kind of satisfaction that went deeper than economics. The quiet satisfaction of competence, of mastery, of being the kind of farmer who knew his animals and knew his land and knew what to do when things went wrong, instead of standing there helpless while something died in front of him. Earl Harlan ran cattle on that Missouri farm for another 22 years after that October morning. He never lost another animal to choke. He raised 3 sons on that farm, and all 3 of them knew the feeding system and the emergency response before they were old enough to drive. When the youngest one started farming on his own, 40 miles away on land he had been saving for since he was 14 years old, the first thing he built on the new property was a feed bunk, the right height, long enough for the whole herd with room to spare. And on the first cold morning of his first winter, as a farmer in his own right, before he put any feed in it, he ran a batch of corn through the roller mill and dampened it down with water from the standpipe in the barn. He had learned it from his father. His father had learned it from his father. And his father had learned it the hard way alone in a frosty pasture, with his hands on a cow's neck, and the knowledge that everything his family had built depended entirely on what he did in the next 20 minutes. That is how knowledge lives on a farm. Not in books, not in filing cabinets, not in the records of any institution. In hands and in memory, and in the things you teach your children, because you never want them to feel the fear you felt the morning you almost did not know what to do. The old trough trick was never patented, never formally named, never celebrated in any way that left a monument. It was just passed on, quietly, from one set of hands to the next. And in being passed on, it saved animals and farms and families across the length and breadth of rural America for generations, which is as good a legacy as any piece of knowledge can hope to have. Thank you so much for watching. If this story connected with you, if you have family memories of cattle farming, or if you simply appreciate the depth of knowledge that ordinary American farm families carried and passed down through generations, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel reach more people who love this kind of history. Subscribe so you never miss a new video, and share this one with someone who would appreciate it. These stories deserve to be heard and remembered. This video is inspired by real events and real agricultural practices documented in American farming history. It does not aim to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Earl Harlan is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American cattle farmers who faced exactly these situations during the 1930s through 1970s. His story is their story.